By 1901, the railway line reached Port Florence, which is the current Kisumu. That was the intention by the British then. Getting to Kisumu, which is on the shores of Lake Victoria, so that they could also get into Uganda and maybe take control of the source of the Nile. Lake Victoria is the source of Nile. Then they can control, I think, the better part of Africa.
Setting foot on the African continent, the settlers aspired to turn the vast fertile land of Kenya into white man's paradise. In the 1930s and 1940s, a storm of resistance was brewing among local communities who had been stripped of lands. On December 12, 1963, Kenya became fully independent from colonial rule. The wave of decolonization swept across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s, leading to the independence of some 30 African countries. The legacy of colonial economy continued to constrain Kenya's development for decades.
Here we have a prototype of 87 class locomotive, which was the very fast locomotive, diesel electric locomotives made by the British, but they have since now become obsolete because they are quite old. The coming of the white settlers into Kenya and by extension Africa, I think was driven by their need for the raw materials.
Sivili Mwelemi, 58, was describing the history of British colonization in East Africa more than 100 years ago. Mwelemi, he was a locomotive driver who had worked at Kenya Railways for over 3 decades. The railway was built by the British colonists in East Africa between 1896 and 1901 to tighten control over the British East Africa. The British government decided to lay a rail to control the entire Nile River basin originating from Lake Victoria. It was initially named the Uganda Railway after its destination.
The construction of Kenya Railways, actually, it was not Kenya Railways. Kenya Railways only came later, after several decades. You see, the people who are engaged in the construction of the line were not the locals actually. The real builders were the Indian coolies. And along the way, well, it also met a lot of challenges from the locals. Locals with their tribal chiefs or chiefdoms or whatever formed the resistance for the white people when they came to occupy.
In the eyes of the local tribes, the railway was an iron snake. An ancient tribal prophecy said an iron snake would someday cross their land and would be a bad omen, creating trouble as it went. With the construction of the railway, the British invaded from the coast into the interior of East Africa. The local tribes were subjected to savage looting, killing, and the colonial enslavement thereafter. The new Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway, built by China, is running largely in parallel with the old one. The new railway drastically reduced the travel time and the costs of freight service. It emerged as the preferred choice for commuters, playing a pivotal role in stimulating commerce and empowering smaller towns along its corridor. The railway epitomizes the Belt and Road cooperation between China and Kenya.
I joined Afristar, the SGR operator, on January 9, 2021. I currently hold the position of Assistant Manager at SGR in the Locomotive and Rolling Stock Department. My daily responsibilities and tasks entail overseeing the smooth running of daily programs by the operations workshop team, ranging from running of trains operations, the continuous training and supervision of driving fraternity. What Kenya and maybe the larger African continent should do is develop own capacity. The SGR, I can say, is the largest project after independence in Kenya. We can now say it handles most of the imports and exports into and from Kenya and her neighbors. It's one of the largest contributors for the country. I think my work is very meaningful in that I guide the young team in this field.